Right now, I am standing in the very heart and center of the Brazilian city of Florianópolis, the capital and second largest metropolitan area of the state of Santa Catarina. Right now, I am standing in Praça 15 de Novembro, the very center of the historic center of Florianópolis, or Floripa, as the locals like to call it. Behind me is the Metropolitan Cathedral. That's the most important Catholic church here in the city of Florianópolis. Now, we're actually on an island right now. This island is called Santa Catarina Island, but the municipal boundaries of the city of Florianópolis covers the entirety of the island, and so you could call the island Florianópolis, Floripa, Santa Catarina Island, whatever you prefer. It's all the same thing. Now, we'll walk a little bit through the square here as I tell you about the history and the culture of this city and this region of Brazil. Now, this square is called Praça 15 de Novembro. That means the 15th of November square. That date is when Brazil transitioned from a constitutional monarchy under Emperor Dom Pedro II to what it is today, which is a constitutional republic, a democracy. Now, that occurred on November 15th, 1889. The reason for that is because a year earlier, in 1888, Brazil ended slavery. Brazil imported roughly half of the African slaves that came here to the New World, to the Americas, came here to Brazil. And Brazil was the last country in the Americas, the last country of European settlement in the world to end slavery in 1888. And so many of the wealthy landowners and slave owners, who were primarily in the north, where slavery was centered, in the northeast of Brazil, as well as in Minas Gerais, in the areas with silver and gold mines. They were very angry at Dom Pedro II for doing this, and so they staged a coup. They overthrew the emperor, although he was very old and he was probably going to die pretty soon anyway. So Brazil was likely going to transition to some form of democracy regardless. But anyway, they were upset over the end of slavery, and so they staged a coup, and they implemented what is called the First Brazilian Republic. And so many of the historic squares of Brazil to this day are called Praça 15 de Novembro. Kind of funny to me, because I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a good date, considering that they were upset over the end of slavery and Dom Pedro II was considered kind of a benevolent leader. And so, but I don't know, for whatever reason, the Brazilians do like that date. So anyway, we'll walk through the square. And now Floripa is considered to be the safest major city in Brazil with the highest standard of living of any major city in Brazil. But as we are in the historic center, you're probably going to see in the background maybe, and maybe we'll even be approached while we're filming, by there's quite a few kind of homeless, drug-addicted, mentally ill beggars. That's very common in the historic centers of Brazilian cities. Brazil is similar to the United States, and that is a country with a great divide between rich and poor, a very kind of individualistic culture in which the personal use of drugs as well as the public use of drugs is tolerated. And so you have the same kind of social ill of, like I said, of the homeless, drug-addicted, mentally ill beggars who will kind of wander around and ask you for money to support their habit or to support their life on the street. That's very common in many city centers in the United States. It's also very common here in Brazil. So that's kind of a way in which Brazil and the United States are similar. It's not necessarily an issue of poverty, because the United States is a quite wealthy country, but yet it's very common in the United States. In Brazil, more of a middle-income country, but it's also very common in Brazil. But if you go to a place like, say, Cambodia, that's a very poor country, but the public begging, public homelessness, drug use, these are not socially acceptable. And so the police will crack down, and then it also brings great shame upon the families, and so the families will try to keep their children from engaging in this type of behavior. But Brazil, the United States, these are more individualistic cultures, so maybe the family goes, well, whatever, I don't care if my son is using drugs and begging on the street. And so unfortunately, it happens here. So you'll see that here in this square, even though it is a very lovely square, and this city is very lovely. Now, we are in the south of Brazil. The south of Brazil is much more European than the rest of Brazil. In fact, the demographics of this state, Santa Catarina, which has a population of roughly 7.5 million people, is overwhelmingly European. About 75% of the population here in Santa Catarina is European, with the remaining quarter being mostly Pardo. Pardo being a Portuguese word, a Brazilian word, meaning a person who is of tri-racial background. European, African, and Amerindian, with most Pardos not having any one of those genetic admixtures being a majority of their genome. And then there's a small amount of Africans and even Asians, as well as, of course, Amerindians who live here in Santa Catarina, but it's an overwhelmingly European place. In fact, when I go around Santa Catarina, I actually see many people who look like me. Not so much here in Florianópolis and Floripa, because this is the oldest city in Santa Catarina. It was actually settled in, I believe, 1637. Might be wrong about that. I forget the exact date. It was first discovered, it was first explored, this island, in 1514, but it wasn't settled until, I do believe, 1637. And it was originally called Desterro, but now it's called Florianópolis. And because it is the oldest city in Santa Catarina, it has a much more Portuguese demographic. And so the people here are going to be more Southern European in appearance, with kind of brown hair, so they're going to look a little bit different than me. Whereas other parts of Santa Catarina that were more settled by Northern Europeans from places like Germany or Poland, they're going to have a more lighter appearance. And so when I go to other parts of Santa Catarina, I will see people who do have light hair and light eyes and actually look quite similar to me. But it's a little bit less common here in Floripa and Florianópolis. Now, how did Florianópolis get that name? How did it change its name from Desterro to Florianópolis? Well, in 1889, after Brazil transitions from a constitutional monarchy to a republic, there was a revolt known as the Federalist Revolt, where the people of the South, from Rio Grande do Sul and Santa Catarina, and a little bit even from Paraná, they fought a rebellion against the central government because they wanted a greater deal of political autonomy, or maybe even outright independence from the rest of Brazil. And the leader of Brazil at that time, he was the second president, he was the first vice president. His name was Floriano. I think his last name was like Deschutto, something like that. So Floriano Deschutto, maybe. He was the second president of Brazil, and he led the forces of Brazil to come here and crush the rebellion. Because of his heavy-handed tactics, he was known in Portuguese as the Iron Marshal. And so he came here to Florianópolis, he killed many Southerners. He hung them here in the square to send a message to the Federalists that Brazil, would rule the South, and that any dissent, any rebellion would be met with extreme violence. And that tension between the central government in Brazil, first in Rio de Janeiro, and now the government in Brasilia, there's always been some tension between here in the South and the government in the North. In fact, there's actually a movement for independence here in the South. The name of it in Portuguese is O Sul é o meu país. That means the South is my country in Portuguese. And because the South is much more demographically European than the rest of Brazil, this has resulted in an economy, a culture that is very different than the rest of Brazil. The standard of living, the development, is higher here than in other parts of Brazil. Lower crime rates, much less trash in the city. People are much more quiet. It is very noticeably different here in the South than the rest of Brazil. When you see the people are wearing much more muted colors, more natural fibers, whereas in northern Brazil they're wearing brighter colors, more polyester fabrics. The things that we kind of associate with Afro-Brazilian tropical culture of Brazil, like samba, capoeira, African religions, funk, the music style of funk. These things are much less common here in the south of Brazil. And the climate is much less different. Most of Brazil is tropical, but here in the south, we're not in the tropics, we're in the subtropics. And so there actually are seasons here in Brazil. Today it's still a fairly warm day, it's the middle of fall, but as it goes into winter, it'll actually get quite cool here in Florianópolis and in other parts of southern Brazil. And so of course this is a bit of a pipe dream. Will the South ever become independent? Almost certainly not. But it is something that the people here like to talk about, and it's something that's certainly interesting. And I myself have certainly noticed it. You know, I started my journey here in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, and then I went to Sao Paulo, and then I went to Curitiba, and now I'm here in Florianópolis, and I've seen it myself, that basically in Brazil, the further south you go, the more quiet, the more European, the more developed, the more peaceful it becomes. Whereas the further north you go in Brazil, the more African, the more kind of energetic and colorful, and also poor and violent it becomes. And so there is a marked regional difference here in Brazil. It's important to remember that Brazil is a massive country, some 200 million people, and it's about the size of the continental United States. In fact, it's a little bit bigger than the continental United States, the lower 48. So if the United States didn't have Alaska, I do believe that Brazil would actually be slightly bigger. So right now, you might be able to see we've kind of walked out of the center and we're now in a more open area. That's because the center of Florianópolis is here on the edge of the island in a kind of little flat area. And there's actually the bay that goes out behind me, and you can kind of see it here. And so anyway, we'll walk a little bit over here. If you can see here, there is the Legislative Assembly, the government area of Santa Catarina, because this is the capital of Santa Catarina. And so the government facilities like the Legislative Assembly and other government offices, they're all over here in the government quarters. You can't quite see it so well because there are some trees and the bus station in the way, but it's right there. We could walk over there, but there's not really any point because unfortunately Brazil has this tendency of building its government buildings, whether it's the federal capital in Brasilia or state governments like in Curitiba or here, or in Sao Paulo or here in Florianópolis. The Brazilians have unfortunately, I would say, negative habit of building their government buildings in a much more modern style. So the buildings are all built in the 1960s, 1970s, kind of soulless, concrete, steel, glass. So it's not like going to other countries like Mexico or Europe or even the United States, where the Capitol buildings, those government buildings, they are in beautiful, classical, old architecture. Unfortunately in Brazil, for whatever reason, they've decided to build all their government buildings new. And so I went to the Legislative Assembly yesterday, I took a picture in front of it, and it's just some kind of soulless, it could looks like any other office building anywhere. It's kind of sad, it's unfortunate. But I don't know, the Brazilian government thinks that maybe that's a symbol of progress, or I don't really understand it myself, but it makes sense to them. But you can also see behind me, there's a little bit of a neighborhood going up on the hillside. This is a very hilly island. And so like many parts of Brazil, there are these neighborhoods that go up the sides of steep hills right next to the city center. Well, yeah, that pretty much covers Florianópolis, Santa Catarina. Really enjoyed my time here. It really is noticeably quieter and more peaceful than the other parts of Brazil I went to. I remember I was walking on the waterfront along the bayside. There's a beautiful trail that rings the Historic Center here in Florianópolis, and I was walking it for quite a long time last night, and it was just so quiet. There wasn't loud pounding music, there wasn't aggressive people grabbing me and trying to get me to buy things or give them money like you might experience in Rio or other parts of Brazil. And so it really is a very peaceful place. It almost sometimes feels like I'm in another country. In fact, there are a lot of foreigners here. A lot of people from Argentina, Uruguay come here, and you're going to hear a lot of Spanish. and even the long-term residents of Floripa who are from Argentina or Uruguay or Chile. They speak kind of a hybrid of Portuguese and Spanish, known as, I do believe, Portuñol. So you'll hear sometimes people speaking Spanish but with kind of a Portuguese accent, some Portuguese words thrown in. You'll see that around here because Argentina, Uruguay, they don't have any truly tropical, warm weather beaches that are really lush and rugged and verdant like here. And so a lot of them like to come here. It's what's probably the most popular vacation destination for Argentinians and maybe even Uruguayans as well. And so you'll see a lot of them here. But even though it is touristy and there are a lot of foreigners, the sellers are much more respectful and much more quiet. It really is such a pleasant, wonderful place to be. So if you ever find yourself here in the Southern Hemisphere, in South America, in the Southern Cone, here in beautiful Brazil, I of course recommend coming down to the south. It might not be quite like your stereotypical expectations of Brazil, with the bright colors and the carnival and the funk and the samba. Not gonna quite be that as much here in the south, but it is still going to be very unique, very special, very beautiful, and a really high quality of life, at least by Brazilian standards. All right, until next time, ciao.